Judge's halt is in place. Many are hoping to get more answers over the next week or so to the possible impacts of the President Trump's freezing of the funding.
Yeah, News 3's Tiffany Lane is here in the studio. She's been looking into this. You've been talking with local experts and those who say they're already feeling the pressure.
Yeah, good evening. For the last few hours, what I've heard from people that there are more questions than answers, as you mentioned. A lot of people just trying to figure out what this all means. And several organizations and institutes are still scrambling to get a better understanding on how they could possibly be impacted. The White House did make it very clear today that individual assistance like Social Security benefits, Medicare and food stamps, for example, would not be impacted by the pause. But as you mentioned, in the meantime, the judge's order will be in place through Monday, meaning the president's administration cannot suspend any congressionally appropriated funds until then.
This is not a blanket pause on federal assistance and grant programs from the Trump administration.
White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt responding to media questions Tuesday as people around the country left uncertain about the impacts of President Trump's federal freeze on federal grant programs. Institutions like universities, K-12 school districts, nonprofits, and healthcare organizations among the many potentially impacted before a judge put a temporary halt. The order would have potentially impacted millions of Americans and trillions in government spending.
Our state budget is about 30% reliant on federal funding. We have hundreds, thousands of nonprofits here that provide critical services to people with disabilities, to seniors, to veterans, that, some of the times their budgets are between 20 and 50% reliant on federal funding.
Dr. Rebecca Gill, an associate professor of political science at UNLV, gave a generic example of how the president's directive could impact higher education.
It can be medical research. It can be all sorts of different scientific exploration, DNA research, all of this. And so that money comes from the federal government and it goes to the universities where these where these researchers are housed.
I also spoke with an anonymous source from Southern Nevada. She works for a consulting company that works with community health centers nationwide to provide federal grant management support. She says clients were scrambling to access grant money before the Trump administration's pause, thankful when a judge put a temporary stop.
Some of the smaller health centers, especially in rural communities, this is their main source of funding. And so if they aren't able to draw down on their grant, they are not going to meet payroll. And so our advice is to look at loan options from their bank. There may be layoffs if they cannot support operations.
She says patients would take a major hit.
Primarily medical, dental, behavioral health support services. And also, besides supporting the low income and uninsured, some of these health centers also have special population funding for homeless and migrant health centers.
Nevada Congresswoman Susie Lee says she also heard from concerned constituents Tuesday morning.
I have a constituent whose daughter was accepted to pharmacy school. And because that funding has been frozen, they were hit with a $22,000 bill for her tuition because she had a fellowship through the NIH. We have reports from constituents who are waiting, or from people in this country who are waiting for bone marrow transplants, critical cancer clinical trials. Many of those are being put on hold.
The president's directive leading some to question the constitutionality to put such a vast freeze on grants.
The Impoundment Act is aimed at ensuring that the priorities that are set forth by Congress in these laws that have funding attached, that those priorities are carried out unless there is subsequent legislation that changes that. But that isn't to say that there isn't a lot of wiggle room around the edges. And so, if you look at the case law, you will see that there's a lot of nuance with, the situations where a president does have the discretion to make decisions about how to implement things.
Now, Congresswoman Lee said Democratic lawmakers will use every legal resource if the president's freeze moves forward, saying it's unconstitutional. Now, that is something that the courts will be the ones deciding. But again, people are hoping over the next week, while the federal judge's freeze is in place, to get a better understanding of who could potentially be impacted, because I think right now there is just a lot of confusion, and we're hoping to provide more updates and give more answers for our community members. Back to you.
All right, a lot of people confused and fearful as well.